Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today we have a video featuring papakahnn versus Dan Napolitano. We see papakahnn playing as the ever-popular Dark Eldar Warlord Packmaster Kith, whereas Dan is going to be picking up the reins of Baharroth, the Eldar Warlord. In taking a look at our planet layout, we've got Taurus as planet number 1, which rewards players for keeping their unit count low. We have Aatrox Prime as planet number 2, Farron as planet number 3, which routes target non-warlord units, and of course Planum is number 4, which allows the movement of non-warlords that a player happens to control. And fifth and final planet is going to be Ossus 4. It looks as though both of our players have decided not to take a mulligan, and in looking at our planet layout a little bit more closely, it's favoring Kith. I believe Taurus is a little bit dangerous because Kith generates a lot of Chimera tokens. It's difficult for her to keep her unit count low, and the sooner that Taurus is eliminated from the board for Kith, the better. The same thing goes with Aatrox Prime, unless if Dan isn't able to trigger this effect to potentially kill off some of those Chimera tokens, it could potentially allow papakahnn to reach critical mass in regard to accumulating some kind of nasty Chimera swarm very, very quickly. Both players happen to have 7 cards and 7 resources. The initiative token is currently in Dan's hands, and we see his first card being a Wild Rider Squadron played out to planet number 2. So that's a very formidable combatant put out at Aatrox Prime. He's going to have the initiative potentially battling at that planet, and he could also shift it to either adjacent planets, either 1 or 3. We see a Murder of Razorwings put out by papakahnn at planet number 1. It doesn't have any command, but it'll allow him to win that battle there, and we happen to see Dan randomly discard a copy of Ion Rifle, which gives away that he is indeed allied with the Tau. We see a Baharroth friendly Death from Above, allowing him to put a Soaring Falcon into play at planet number 5. And that's a 2-command mobile unit that's going to essentially allow him to win command almost wherever it is that he'd like to place it. We happen to see a Warlock Destructor played at planet number 1 for our Dark Eldar player. He's revealed his hand in being allied with the Eldar, and that's going to be a very formidable combat unit. We happen to see another copy of Warlock Destructor played out by Dan instead, opposite papakann's forces, also at the first planet, and now we have no more resources for Dan, only 2 cards in hand, and we see Kith with 4 resources and 5 cards. If we see Kith commit his warlord to the first planet, he's going to not only generate a Chimera token, but he'll also potentially steal initiative. But if Baharroth goes to Taurus, we could very well see the initiative rest in the hands of our Eldar player, and that would allow Baharroth to at least tie up command at that planet, and then that Wild Rider Squadron could shift to planet number 1. I would imagine that if Baharroth could win that fight, his unit total will not be lower than Kith's, but at least he'll prevent Kith from winning Taurus, and he might not be able to win Aatrox Prime, but we'll have to see how things end up going. Perhaps the best move for Baharroth might ultimately be to send Baharroth to Aatrox Prime. Perhaps the best move for Dan might be to send Baharroth to Aatrox Prime, just so that he can indeed take advantage of mobile. He can win command at Aatrox Prime and then shift over prior to a battle beginning if he needs to, just to ensure that the initiative token is going to be in his hands. So it all kind of remains to be seen, but it's presently papakann's turn to take a deployment. It looks as though we see a copy of Incubus Warrior played out to Planet 5 opposite that Soaring Falcon, so probably prior to the Soaring Falcon being able to mobile away from that planet, that's going to ensure that our Dark Eldar player manages to tie command at planet number 5 with Dan. So Dan indicates that he is past, he's entirely done with deployment, and just taking one more look at our planet layout, it seems as though we could see this game draw to a close as early as planet number 3. If one of our players happens to be incredibly aggressive, we end up seeing a second copy of the Incubus Warrior, the remainder of Papakann's resources. He's yet to decide which planet he's going to be committing this to, but it eventually serves to be Farron as well, so he's got a reasonable combat presence at each of these different planets. In picking where they'd like to send their warlord, I can only imagine that Kith is likely going to be going to planet number 1, Baharroth is likely going to be going to planet number 2. I could see both players being as aggressive as possible, just because it really seems like Dan needs to try and get advantage of these battle abilities, if at all possible. Baharroth ends up being committed to planet number 3 so that he can hopefully snipe off this Incubus Warrior, trigger the battle ability here to rout some sort of future unit like this Incubus Warrior further down the line, and we end up seeing Packmaster Kith go to the first planet. She generates a Chimera token, and now this single Warlock Destructor controlled by Dan is looking a little bit outclassed, just in considering all of its opposition. Papakahnn ends up reeling in 1 card and 1 resource, whereas Dan gets 1 card and 3 resources. So going into our combat phase prior to mobile, it looks as though Dan has a command action. And Dan ends up playing a copy of Tense Negotiations. So we see Baharroth exhaust in order to trigger this battle ability at Farron. So what is he going to be routing? It looks like he's decided to route this copy of the Warlock Destructor, which is very interesting indeed. This sets him up to potentially be hit by this 3-attack Incubus Warrior, so a very curious move indeed, and I'll be curious to see whether or not that pays off for him. Certainly this Warlock Destructor has a lot of hit points. Dan happens to have 2 cards in hand, but he's far from invincible. This Wild Rider Squadron can certainly swoop in and help the Warlock Destructor if need be, but between the two of these units, I'm just deadly curious in regard to seeing what exactly is going to happen. We see the Soaring Falcon move from planet number 5 to planet number 4. Baharroth moves from 3 to 2, and that's going to allow him to win a battle at Aatrox Prime. He's going to be able to dodge away from this Incubus Warrior's attack of 3, and he's going to be able to, in all likelihood, take a shot at our Dark Eldar player's headquarters or at Farron to potentially kill this Incubus Warrior. So as combat begins, Kith of course happens to possess initiative. The Chimera token takes a swing at the Warlock Destructor. It ends up taking 2 points of damage in total. We do not see any shields whatsoever. Once again, we happen to see 1 resource, 4 cards for Papakahnn, 2 resources, 2 cards for our Eldar player. So there's no Archon's Terror. We end up seeing the Warlock Destructor take a swing at Packmaster Kith. She discards her signature attachment, the Agonizer of Bryn, to reduce that 3 damage down to 0. And now it's essentially going to be free reign for Papakahnn to destroy this Warlock Destructor. I'm very curious as to whether or not this Wild Rider Squadron is going to be swooping in. That probably would have been much more likely had that Warlock Destructor's damage not been entirely circumvented. A Murder of Razorwings ends up adding 1 additional point of damage onto this Warlock Destructor. We do not have any actions on part of Papakahnn. Do we see something from Dan? It seems as though Dan does choose to shift his Wild Rider Squadron over to the first planet. It's a 3-4, and now it's entirely free to attack. He takes a swing at Packmaster Kith. That's going to be 3 incoming damage. We see a copy of Promotion discarded. That reduces Papakann's hand total down to 2, and now he's got 2 damage on Packmaster Kith, and that's going to bring us to an end of this first combat round. It looks like Baharroth is still sitting at the second planet, and there's still quite the combat going on at planet number 1. Both players happen to have 2 cards in hand. I can't think of any Eldar events that would be useful in this situation. It looks as though Packmaster Kith takes a swing of 2 at that Wild Rider squadron, adds on 2 points of damage, and we finally see all of our units ready, and instead of a new combat round beginning, we at least see Packmaster Kith choose to retreat. So the Chimera stay, the Murder of Razorwings stay, and then of course all of Dan's units are going to stay, seeing as how the player with the initiative token has to choose first. And now let's see how this all winds down. In taking a look at unit totals at the moment, our Eldar player happens to have 4 units, our Dark Eldar happens to have 6, so if we see the Chimera token, if we see the Murder of Razorwings destroyed, then neither of those are going to be... then in that case we would not see Taurus activated, but it seems as though Dan has indeed chosen to retreat, so both of his formidable combat units are back in his HQ, and it seems as though Kith has won the battle at the first planet, so she's not going to be able to generate any cards or resources from that ability, but she is going to win 1 green and 1 red icon, which means that if Kith manages to win the next couple planets, then this game could full well go to Kith. We see Baharroth ready, a new combat round begins at our planet number 2, and Baharroth chooses to take a shot at Kith's HQ. So what exactly do we see happen in regard to damage? Certainly a lot of squishy targets in there. Kith takes a point of damage, that Chimera token is destroyed, the Warlock Destructor takes a point of damage, and the Murder of Razorwings is destroyed. So a very effective attack indeed, and hopefully giving up planet number 1 isn't going to eventually hurt Dan in the long run. It seems as though both players indicate they're done with actions, and now we're going to move into the headquarters phase. Both players end up drawing 4 resource tokens. They draw an additional couple cards from their deck. We see planet number 5 is now Yavvarn. It's another triple icon planet, and of course any battle won there could allow players to put a unit into play directly into their HQ. As our deploy phase begins, the initiative token is in papakann's hands. He happens to have 4 resources, 4 cards, compared to Dan's 6 resources and 4 cards. We see his opening action being putting a Kith's Chimera Masters into play at planet number 1, which is now Aatrox Prime, and that's going to set him up potentially very well to try and really just push this first planet as much as Dark Eldarly possible in order to sweep a victory and potentially win as early as the next turn through material icons. Dan ends up putting into play a copy of the Iyanden Wraithguard. It's 3 cost, it attacks for 4, it has Armor Bane, but Kith happens to have the initiative token. The only problem here is that if that unit can't be destroyed in a single swing, it's going to be able to bloody Kith, seeing as how she already has 3 points of damage. So that's going to make committance to the first planet a very dangerous proposition indeed, and seeing as how our Dark Eldar player hasn't come across his copy of the Chimera Den yet, that's going to be very risky if he does choose to go to the first planet. We see papakahnn put out a copy of Void Pirate at planet number 5, which happens to be opposed by a Void Pirate controlled by Baharroth. And now it's setting up our players to move into the command phase. Papakahnn is at 1 resource, 2 cards. Dan is at 2 resources, 2 cards. And let's see if we can expect anything else from our Eldar player prior to command. We see yet another copy of a Warlock Destructor played out to planet number 1. So it seems as though Baharroth is either going to make it extraordinarily dangerous for Kith to end up going to the first planet, tons and tons of risk in that proposition there, and it seems as though that's in all likelihood going to simply stretch out this game. Kith unless he happens to have a Archon's Terror in hand or something to that effect, he can't really safely send his Warlord to the first planets. I could easily see him going to planet number 2 or 3 to try and move a unit or route a unit. Baharroth is almost certainly going to want to send himself to planet number 2 so that he can mobile to planet number 1 or planet number 3 as the situation seems to warrant it. It looks like both of our players have chosen where exactly they intend to send their warlords. Packmaster Kith is being very ballsy. She ends up picking planet number 1, so the initiative will rest in her hands, and we see Baharroth go to planet number 2, so he will be able to mobile to planet 1 if he feels necessary, and the Wild Rider Squadron can similarly use its combat action to move to planet number 1. It looks like both of our players are going to end up winning command on 2 different planets. Planet number 5, of course, with the 2 Void Pirates, is going to be tied. Packmaster Kith ends up drawing 1 card, generating 3 resources, and the exact same can be said for Dan. So combat is going to begin. Aatrox Prime is on the line, and this is going to be very curious indeed. I can only imagine that Baharroth is going to be using his mobile ability to move to planet number 1. We do end up seeing Baharroth use mobile to go to planet number 1. The Soaring Falcon also happens to be mobile. It could potentially shift to planet 2 or planet 4 just to basically match or block command with those Incubus Warriors. And now Aatrox Prime is up for grabs. The initiative token is in Packmaster Kith's hand. We do end up seeing a copy of Archon's Terror played out to banish the Iyanden Wraithguard. So I believe that was a card, the first card in papakahn's hand, which means he must have been holding on to it for some time. So that's a very timely play of that event, in all likelihood saving Packmaster Kith from being outright bloodied in but a single additional shot. And seeing as how this game might be ever so slightly drawn out, it's going to be very important that Packmaster Kith remain hale as long as possible. And all of a sudden this is a formidable amount of opposition indeed, staring down poor Baharroth. Papakahnn still has 2 resources, 2 cards in hand, whereas Dan has 3 resources, enough to fund and empower, but only 2 cards in hand. He's unlikely to have many shields. He could have his Wild Rider Squadron move in, but he does not have the initiative token, and there's going to be quite a few different attacks to deal with prior to a safe opportunity to relocate the Wild Rider Squadron. And seeing as how it itself already has 2 points of damage, that seems as if it'd be an extraordinarily dangerous proposition to relocate it. So we've thus far yet to see a single attack. What exactly are we going to see from our Dark Eldar player? We see a Chimera token exhaust, and what exactly is it going to be attacking? It ends up taking a swing at Baharroth, our elusive Eldar Warlord. Baharroth ends up taking a grand total of 2 points of unshielded damage, and without any actions from Papakahnn, no actions from Dan, it's going to be his opportunity to respond. He takes a swing of 3 at Packmaster Kith. This is essentially oh my. So Packmaster Kith is outright bloodied. Definitely was not expecting that. But she is now a 1/5 that no longer generates Chimera tokens. So a tremendous strength of this Dark Eldar Warlord is now entirely deprived of Papakahnn. We see a second Chimera take an attack. Its target this time is the Warlock Destructor that has yet to take any damage whatsoever. It seems as though Dan chooses to allow both points of damage to go through. Both of our players only have 2 cards remaining in hand, no actions from Papakahnn. Do we see any kind of action whatsoever from Dan? Dan apparently plays a Gift of Isha, which is going to return a Warlock Destructor to play, and that's going to be extraordinarily nasty indeed. He's only got 1 resource left, but that's going to be a very formidable combatant. It is going to survive until the end of the phase, So I'm very curious as to whether or not we're going to see some of these units retreat. The major problem here is that if our Dark Eldar player chooses to give up the battle at Aatrox Prime, his headquarters is going to be blasted by this planet, or Farron is going to be blasted, and then that could potentially kill this Incubus Warrior. We end up seeing Dan's Warlock Destructor take a swing at Papakann's Warlock Destructor, and that's ultimately destroyed. Dan's Baharroth ended up killing a copy of the Kith's Chimera Masters, and now it's going to be the end of the combat round. The initiative token still rests with papakahnn. He indicates he's going to stay with both, so I guess he's going to try to press as much damage as possible. I suppose it's definitely worth getting that damage out there, though I can only imagine that this Incubus Warrior's life is essentially going to be forfeit unless papakahnn happens to have a shield card in hand, but seeing as how Packmaster Kith happened to be bloodied, I can't imagine he's still holding on to shields, otherwise he'd have tried to prevent that. We see a Chimera token attempt to destroy this non-Gift of Ishud Warlock Destructor, but it fails to do so thanks to a timely discard of a Cry of the Wind, Baharroth's signature event that allows a unit to essentially move again after it's already moved once. We see a Chimera token destroyed by a Warlock Destructor. We see another Chimera token destroyed by a Warlock Destructor, and at this point there are no additional actions and the battle is going to conclude, and I can only imagine that Aatrox Prime is going to launch an attack at Farron as opposed to chipping another point of damage off onto Packmaster Kith. So Dan targets that Incubus Warrior with Aatrox Prime, and the Incubus Warrior is destroyed, so things are very much not looking too great for Packmaster Kith. This copy of Warlock Destructor that's entirely unwounded is going to leave play at the end of the combat phase, but at the present moment we have no more battles taking place, and that is going to bring us straight to the headquarters phase. Dan manages to capture Aatrox Prime, the first planet he's managed to capture. He's got one red and one blue icon, whereas our Dark Eldar player has one red and one green icon, so it looks as though the earliest that Baharroth could potentially win the game is not Farron, it's not Planum, it's not even Ossus 4. So it's looking like none of our players are going to be able to win until Yavvarn for Baharroth, or if Kith comes back, Kith could potentially win as early as Ossus 4. So it looks like there are at least a few more rounds in store for this game, unless Packmaster Kith ends up being hunted down by some of these mobile or planet-shifting Eldar units. Our deploy phase has began. The initiative token rests in the hands of the Eldar. He spends 3 of his resources to put out a copy of Baharroth's Hawks, which happens to get +3 attack while it's at a planet with the Warlord controlling that unit. It has 2 command. It's played out at planet number 3 to match this Incubus Warrior, which is going to deny Kith additional resources. We end up seeing a copy of Archon's Palace put into play at Kith's HQ, which is going to be incredibly handy in that these 2 players are both doing fairly similarly in a command sense, and being able to pick the resource or card bonus for any planet once per round could potentially be absolutely huge. Something like Farron that could block 2 resources, or it could block a card or a resource at Planum. There's a lot of fascinating possibilities with that card. Dan indicates that he has passed, and are we going to see anything else from our Kith? We see a copy of Kith's Chimera Masters, which is going to generate one of probably scarcely few additional Chimera tokens we'll see for the remainder of the game. It ends up being played out to planet number 4, and it generates a Chimera token, and it allows our Dark Eldar player to trump command at Yavvarn, so all of a sudden he's going to win that planet, planet, he's going to be able to draw an additional card from that Void Pirate. We see a signature event, Pact of the Homunculi, put into play. He sacrifices that newly generated Chimera token in order to discard a card at random from Dan's hand, which ended up being a very valuable Warlock Destructor, and we see Kith end up drawing 2 different cards. So Kith now has 0 resources, 3 cards, relative to Dan's 2 resources and 0 cards. So let's see if Kith can manage to effectively choke out our opponent, thanks in part to this Archon's Palace, as well as the timely deployment of this Kith's Chimera Masters. papakahnn indicates he is entirely done. Where are our warlords going to go? The trick here is Kith does not want to be destroyed. She does not have the initiative token, and Baharroth can essentially mobile around the board in order to potentially get in an attack on Kith before Kith has the opportunity to attack back. So we might see something sneaky like Baharroth going to something straightforward like planet number 1 or I would imagine planet number 2, and then that's effectively going to force Kith to go to, say, planet number 5. But for all I know, maybe Baharroth is going to be extraordinarily gutsy and go to planet number 5, but I'm predicting 2 for Eldar, 5 for Kith. Both of our players reveal their dials. It seems as though Baharroth has chosen planet number 4, so he's going to essentially deny his opponent of Yavvarn. He's going to benefit from his rogue trader, and we see Kith end up at planet number 2. So Kith is going to have the battle initiative. She'll be able to retreat as her first combat turn. We end up seeing Archon's Palace, presumably, okay, he chooses to go with the card bonus for that planet, so that's going to be fairly effective, I suppose. In regard to resources, it seems as though command is going to be 1 at planet number 1 and planet number 4 by our Eldar player, and at planet number 2 by Kith, and that's all that Kith is going to get, 1 resource and 1 card relative to Dan's kind of paltry 2 resources. But as our command phase draws to a close, we now see the opportunity for units to use mobile. The Soaring Falcon, there's really not much use, if any, for it to do anything at all, just because Kith can run away. The Baharroth's Hawks aren't going to be able to deal out any damage unless there's a Warlord present, so it's possible that they might mobile over to Yavvarn to ensure that this Kith's Chimera Masters are destroyed, but if that does end up happening, then they're very far from, where combat needs to be taking place, and if they just sit there at Ossus number 4, that's in all likelihood going to be the victory condition for Baharroth. So let's see what happens. We do see Baharroth decide to trigger his mobile in order to shift over to Ossus 4, and that means there's going to be no battle taking place at Yavvarn. There's only going to be battles taking place at planets 2 and 3. I can only imagine that Kith is going to try to retreat as quickly as possible, and this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for Baharroth to be literally guaranteed to kill off this Incubus warrior. papakahnn does not have enough resources to afford an Archon's Terror to rout this Baharroth's Hawks, and as soon as it attacks for 3 against the Incubus warrior, the best that papakahnn happens to have left are 2 shield cards, so that's going to be absolutely fantastic. Theron is going to be won entirely uncontested by Dan, and in regard to routing units, perhaps he's going to pick the Kith's Chimera Masters or a Void Pirate. He is indeed going to pick that copy of Kith's Chimera Masters, so he'll send that packing back to the HQ. The following round, it's going to arrive at whatever planet it goes to exhausted. It won't contribute its command icon, and it makes it all the more likely that Baharroth is ultimately going to be able to win command, so very well played by Dan. His Wild Rider Squadron, of course, bounces back into his headquarters, and now we're going to see a battle fought at Planum. The initiative token is is going to be in Kith's hands, and is she going to use her first action? Indeed, she does retreat. So this Soaring Falcon could have dealt out a fair bit of damage to Kith over time, and for all we know, I suppose Dan didn't actually have any cards left in hand, but it could have potentially been a great opportunity for him to use something like a Gift of Isha to bounce a Warlock Destructor back into play to deal out a monumental amount of damage to Kith, and as soon as she happens to take 5 points of damage, she is destroyed, and this game is over immediately. Planum's ability activates, and the Wild Rider Squadron ends up being moved to our soon-to-be second planet, Ossus 4. A battle is going to be taking place at this planet, and that's going to be an excellent opportunity for, just like I mentioned earlier, Baharroth's Hawks to score a guaranteed kill against this Incubus Warrior, which is indeed discarded, destroyed, and now Dan is going to be able to steal Papakann's last remaining resource, putting Dan at 6 resources, 0 cards, relative to Papakann's 0 resources and 4 cards. And that is going to bring our combat phase to a close. As we move into headquarters, each player draws 2 cards, generates 4 resources, so papakahnn has 4 resources, 6 cards, whereas Dan has 10 resources and a meager 2 cards. So if Kith continues choking him of cards, Kith could potentially try to turn this game around and eventually win just by merit of preventing Dan from putting anything powerful into play. We see our new first planet happens to be Planum, and our very last planet in the game is going to be Iridial. So, at the present moment, Dan has 2 red icons, but we don't end up seeing another red icon until Yavvarn, planet number 3. He has 1 blue icon, and we don't see another blue planet until planet number 3. And then he doesn't have any strong point at all, so it seems as though he's going to have to pick up the next 3 planets if he'd like to win, or really all he needs to do is just ensure that he wins Yavvarn. His victory condition is quite far down the line, and so long as he can prevent Kith from winning 2 additional green icons, then Kith isn't going to be able to win the game. We see Siren Zithlex put into play at Yavvarn, and now that Farron is gone, she's safe from being routed, and that's a very potent unit to see interplay at Yavvarn, just because, like I laid out earlier, that is very much the win condition for our Eldar player, and in fact, Kith, if she doesn't end up picking up a victory at Ossus 4. The initiative token is in the hands of our Dark Eldar player, and that's pretty nasty to see, just because this Iyanden Wraithguard, even though it could absolutely obliterate Siren Zithlex, is going to be entirely unable to attack first, and if it ends up destroyed prior to its opportunity to attack, then that is going to be potentially a very powerful unit and a lot of resources and an oh-so-valuable card all down the drain. We see Dan put into play a Shrouded Harlequin at planet number 1, and it's, I think, rather likely that he might try to end up having this unit be destroyed, just so it can end up exhausting a target enemy unit like this Siren Zithlex here. That Siren does kind of double duty in that it's going to allow our Dark Eldar player to win command at Yavvarn as well, and then of course, this Archon's Palace can serve to deprive Dan of cards at still an additional location. But it's presently our Dark Eldar player's opportunity to play cards, and are we going to see any additional deployments from either player? Papakahnn indicates that he has passed, and are we going to see Dan play his remaining card in hand? Is it an event? Is it an attachment? What exactly is it going to be? It could potentially be some kind of formidable army unit. Dan indicates he is also done, and now it's going to be up to both players to decide where they want to send their warlords. I think a fantastic option for Dan is going to be either planet number 2, so that he can use mobile, or potentially planet number 3, just so he can try to beat Siren Zithlex and try to kill her, punish her, and just try to deplete that planet of enemy units as easily as possible. and that would also be a fantastic opportunity for this Baharroth's Hawks to swoop in. The Wild Rider Squadron also has an excellent range of threat in regard to where Kith would like to go. She definitely wants to drop off her combat units, so I'm not surprised by any means to see Kith go to planet number 3. It seems as though Baharroth ended up choosing to go to Iridial just in case Kith may have ventured to go there, I would imagine, so that he could maybe get off an attack. I don't know. I'm not sure I really understand that decision. It seems as though in determining command struggle victories, the Archon's Palace chooses to deprive the card bonus from Iridial. So Packmaster Kith is going to generate 1 card, 1 resource. Dan earns a mere 1 card and 3 resources. So at the present moment, papakahnn has 2 resources, 6 cards, and Daniel is at the opposite extreme with 11 resources and 2 cards. So we're going to see combats taking place at likely the 1st planet and the 4th planet. I can't see Baharroth sticking around to, sit on his hands at planet number, I suppose, 4. We end up seeing no command phase actions from either player, and now mobile. I can only presume that we're going to see some of our Eldar units kind of pile into planet number 3, just to try to kill off as many of these Dark Eldar units as possible. We see Baharroth's Hawks converge on planet number 3, and therefore I can only imagine that Baharroth indeed does go to planet number 3 as well to confer a +3 attack bonus to that Baharroth's Hawks, which would otherwise be attacking for 0. It seems as though an Archon's Terror might be a good option for our Dark Eldar player to banish one of these Eldar units, but even if he were to have 2 copies of Archon's Terror, which he doesn't have enough resources to play, if he were to get rid of the Shrouded Harlequin and the Soaring Falcon from the 1st planet, this Wild Rider Squadron could still move in opportunistically and land a kill. So things are not looking great for Packmaster Kith. She's probably going to want to retreat as quickly as possible, and she's going to have to burn a combat turn in order to do that, and that's going to be an attack afforded to our Eldar player. So if Packmaster Kith ends up running away as the first combat action, then that's going to allow something like the Iendan Wraithguard to absolutely just wreck Siren Zithlex, and then the Void Pirate will die, the Kith's Chimera Masters will die. The first planet is indeed won. Looks like Dan won a grand total of 1 green and 1 blue icon, now putting him very, very close to victory, but still a couple planets shy. The Soaring Falcon bounces to Dan's HQ. I guess that was kind of an interesting choice, allowing that to happen, as opposed to relocating it during the command phase, but maybe he wanted to ensure he didn't lose that planet to something like an Archon's Terror in case he wants this Wild Rider Squadron sitting exactly where it is. In regard to combat, seems like Siren Zithlex is going to take the initiative to take a swing at that Iendan Wraithguard, which is destroyed. I guess Dan must not have any shield cards at all, or he happens to have a Gift of Isha, something to that effect, but he's got 2 cards in hand, and he just lost his 4-attack Armorbane unit. It's now the Eldar player's opportunity to attack. I can only imagine that Packmaster Kith is about to take a few points of damage, but what exactly is going to happen? We do see 6 cards in the hand of our Dark Eldar player, so it could very well be full of shields. We see our Shrouded Harlequin exhaust, and then ready. It seems as though papakahnn says he's contemplating an action. I can only imagine that that action is going to be an Archon's Terror, in all likelihood targeting this Baharroth's Hawks. So let's see how exactly this combat resolves. Keep in mind that this Wild Rider Squadron can swing in at any moment and start attacking for 3, and if this battle is close, that 3-2 unit could definitely make a big bit of difference. We do end up seeing a copy of Archon's Terror played, and it is also targeting that Baharroth's Hawks. It's going to immediately be routed, and now that sets papakahnn back down to 0 resources, which is very, very crucial, because even though that was a very powerful event, resources are becoming an increasingly valuable commodity for our Dark Eldar player, and this is going to be a fantastic opportunity a little bit later in the round, if we don't see a retreat by our Dark Eldar player, to get this Wild Rider squadron to move in. We see Dan's Shrouded Harlequin take a swing, and Packmaster Kith ends up blocking both points of damage by discarding a copy of Suffering. And now it's our Dark Eldar player's opportunity to attack. Will Packmaster Kith take a swing for 1, potentially killing this Shrouded Harlequin? Or is Packmaster Kith simply going to retreat? Are we going to see this Void Pirate attack for 0, just to stall? What are we going to see? Our Dark Eldar player has no more resources and 4 cards in hand. Dan has 2 cards, 11 resources. If Kith stays, if Kith is exhausted, that could be absolutely terrible, because the Iandan Wraithguard remains the top card of our Eldar player's discard pile, and a Gift of Isha recurring that into play could be absolutely horrific in costing Kith the game. Both players indicate that they have no actions whatsoever, and we do see Kith retreat, so she decides to play it safe, and now Baharroth is going to have free reign to start picking apart some of these combatants. I can only imagine that Siren Zithlex is indeed going to be a priority, and we see a combat action trigger to bring that Wild Rider squadron to planet number 2. So it's now, well, currently planet number 3, soon to be planet number 2. The Wild Rider squadron takes a swing at Siren Zithlex. Are we going to see a shield card discarded? And we do see a copy of Suffering discarded. I can only imagine that Kith is going to try to preserve the life of Siren Zithlex so that he can hopefully bring her back into play, set up at some point down the line, perhaps. That copy of Suffering sheds 2 points of damage off that 3 damage swing, but Baharroth is still going to have an opportunity to attack. So is he going to discard another shield card just to save Siren? Does he have another 1 shield card or 2 shield card? It's kind of tricky. That reaction for the Siren is still valuable if she arrives exhausted. That was a very curious choice. I guess Siren Zithlex is ultimately destroyed, so I can only imagine that that copy of Suffering that was discarded was ultimately a bit of a waste. It would have been much better saved for a future round, perhaps? Or I guess maybe he just wanted to retreat to get as many of these units gone as possible, or at least that Void Pirate. But we see the Kith's Chimera Masters stay. I guess our Dark Eldar player must have been doing that as a means of just ensuring that the Void Pirate stays alive so that he can draw as many cards as possible. He must have just kind of garbagey stuff in his hand that isn't doing him any good, so I guess Siren Zithlex and that Suffering discard was just an attempt to try to replace it with something better. We end up seeing Baharroth's copy of Void Pirate retreat. We end up seeing Baharroth's Shrouded Harlequin retreat, and now there's going to be a new combat round with Kith's Chimera Masters getting the first opportunity to attack. All of these units are staying. Kith's Chimera Masters takes a swing at Baharroth, and we do end up seeing that point of damage manage to go through. Baharroth only has 2 cards remaining in hand. I can't imagine that they're shields, but perhaps if they were, he might just be holding on to them for the most valuable time possible. Yvarn is going to be won by Baharroth. I can't imagine that he's going to trigger that battle ability, and Dan confirms that he is indeed not. So Baharroth returns to his HQ, and both players are going to be passing into their headquarters phase. That's 4 more resources, 2 more cards, and that's going to put papakahnn at 4 resources, 5 cards in total, and Dan is going to have an incredible 15 resources and a mere 4 cards. The initiative token is going to be in Dan's hands, and it's going to be up to Dan to try to win these following 2 planets in order to secure him the game. What's very nice is that he can set up his entire army at planet number 2 and then just simply use mobile to shift any of his units that he needs to the first planet, whether it's the Wild Rider Squadron, whether it's Baharroth's Hawks, whether it's Baharroth himself, and there's a maximum of 1 copy remaining in our Dark Eldar player's deck, and he's only seen 21 cards of his deck, so I think it's relatively unlikely that he does have a copy of Archon's Terror sitting in his hand. We see a copy of Iand and Wraithguard played out by Dan to planet number 2. Very nice setup for the following turn. What exactly are we going to see, if anything, from our Dark Eldar player? We end up seeing a copy of Void Pirate played out to the first planet. At least this way, he'll likely be able to send Kith to Iridial in order to ensure that, Kith can win at least a couple cards through the merit of these Void Pirates, if not through Iridial itself, and I can only imagine Kith will probably go to Iridial just to try to activate that card bonus, plus a Void Pirate here. The trick, however, is that if Dan does go to planet number 2, since he's got the initiative token, he could easily mobile Baharroth and a copy of Baharroth's Hawks over to whatever planet Kith happens to be present at and get in an attack before she has an opportunity to retreat. And now there's a copy of Baharroth's Hawks sitting at planet number 1, so if Kith puts a lot of opposition there, Baharroth could jump over to planet number 1 to help out, and the same thing goes with planet number 3, as we see another copy of Baharroth's Hawks played out to that. So it looks as though both of our players have passed at the present moment. Both players are down to 3 resources in total, but the difference here is that Dark Eldar happens to have 4 cards in hand, and he does not have this enormous army that our Eldar Warlord has managed to thus far accumulate. So I'm predicting planet 3 for Kith, planet 2 for Baharroth. We ultimately see planet number 1 for Kith and planet number 2 for Baharroth. So this is a little bit interesting in that we could potentially see a lot of units using mobile to shift to planet number 1, and then of course they're all going to bounce back to the HQ only to be recommit to our following turn's planet number 1 arriving exhausted. So only some of those units are going to be affected, but not all of them. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this copy of Baharroth's Hawks perhaps mobile away if this copy does not mobile to planet number 1. We end up seeing Dan draw 1 card and 1 resource thanks to this frustrating Archon's Palace, and Kith manages to win 2 cards and 2 resources thanks to the planet and both copies of the Void Pirate there. We see that both players pass on any command phase actions. In regard to mobile, this is very curious in regard to what Dan is going to do. I imagine that Baharroth is going to shift over. Kith is only attacking for 1, but there's not really a potent Dark Eldar command presence at this planet. It seems as though Baharroth is actually going to use his mobile to shift over to planet number 3, Iridial, which is very curious indeed. I suppose the Wild Rider Squadron could shift in to ensure that Packmaster Kith cannot win Ossus 4, but it's going to be of the paramount importance. Actually, I suppose Dan could simply just choose to lose Ossus 4, and it seems like he's going to be doing just that. He's going to leave the Soaring Falcon present at that planet to keep harassing Kith, to potentially deprive Kith of a ton of shield cards, and then he's going to make sure that all of his units remain ready to win this battle at Yavvarn, which is going to ultimately decide the game. Just because Dan doesn't need this strong point icon, he's got a ton of resources that are at this point almost entirely unnecessary. So long as he wins Yavvarn, he can easily win through red or blue icons. So I suppose it was a little silly of me in hindsight to stress that Dan wants to win Ossus 4 here, but I think it's incredibly wise that he does leave this Soaring Falcon to harass the bejesus out of Kith to make this victory here as difficult for her as possible. And if she ends up retreating, if she doesn't bring these Void Pirates with her, then that's a fantastic opportunity for Dan to try to snipe off either of those neutral units as well. We end up seeing Kith exhaust. She does decide to take a swing at this Soaring Falcon. Of course, in taking a look at Dan's discard pile, he does happen to have that Iand and Wraithguard at the top of his discard pile. He does have one card in hand. It could very well be a Gift of Isha. He's got 4 resources. As soon as this Soaring Falcon manages to deal 1 point of damage to Packmaster Kith, that could very well be the game. If we end up seeing that Gift of Isha, Dan indicates he has no actions. The Soaring Falcon attacks. I can only imagine that Packmaster Kith is going to be discarding a shield. And we do see a shield put into play. But how many of these shields is Packmaster Kith going to go through? Kith does happen to have 5 remaining cards in hand, but is she really going to risk getting in 4 additional attacks? And we do see the copy of Wild Rider Squadron swoop in. It's okay, we see a copy of the Klavex Warleader put into play. Very nicely done by Packmaster Kith. That Wild Rider Squadron is immediately destroyed, and now this 3/3 attacker gets to take a swing at the Soaring Falcon. Very nicely done indeed. So even if papakahnn does not end up winning this game, that was a very, very fancy, flashy little class action move there. So the Klavex Warleader ends up dealing 3 damage to this Soaring Falcon. It now only has a single hit point remaining, and now it's going to bring us to the end of the combat round as soon as this Void Pirate attacks. And what exactly are we going to see in regard to actions from either player? I definitely was not expecting this Warleader to splash down. I thought that Kith was almost all but toothless at this point. Kith indeed very wisely retreats. A Void Pirate retreats. Both Void Pirates retreat, but the Klavex Warleader stays, as we see the Soaring Falcon very wisely retreat, seeing as how initiative was in Kith's hands. Ossus 4 is going to be won by Kith, and she is going to be able to steal a resource. We actually end up seeing a copy of Foretell used. So Baharroth is going to exhaust to cancel that resource steal, and Baharroth is going to essentially draw a card cantripping that Foretell. So the Klavex Warleader ends up going to Kith's HQ, and now it's all going to come down to Yvarn on the following turn. Iridial is going to be won, and I can only imagine that Dan is going to choose, indeed quite wisely, to remove all of that damage from Baharroth. Baharroth is going to bounce back to the HQ, and now our Eldar player is set up extraordinarily favorably well to win at Yvarn. All of these mobile units can simply shift to Yvarn if necessary. Dan could there's really not any great reason for Dan not to go to planet number 1, just because he probably wants to ensure that he indeed has the initiative token. Our headquarters phase occurs, the very final headquarters phase of the game, because whichever player ends up winning Yvarn is going to win the game. We see 5 resources, 6 cards for papakahnn. We see 8 resources, 3 cards for Dan. What exactly does he have? Does he have a Gift of Isha? What could he have possibly drawn? Our Dark Eldar player has gone through half of his deck at this point. I can only imagine that there's about a 50-50 chance as to whether or not he's drawn his second copy of Klavex Warleader. We see a Pact of the Homunculi played out by our Dark Eldar player, so we see a Void Pirate destroyed. We have to see a random card discard being Foretell discarded from our Eldar player's hand. That's definitely, I'm predicting, not what papakahnn wanted to see discarded. And of course, papakahnn gets to reel in an additional 2 cards as a result of playing the second and only remaining copy of his signature event. And at this point, we see a Doom played out by Baharroth. The Klavex Warleader is destroyed, and the Void Pirate is destroyed. So that was definitely a little bit expensive to destroy those 2 units, but that Warleader is gone, the Void Pirate is gone, and that now all but assures that Dan is going to be able to win, unless Kith manages to reel in some resources, then that means he's not going to have any resources to play a second copy of the Clavex Warleader. He could very well use an Archon's Terror to get rid of one of these units, but that's not really going to be doing that much. We see that Baharroth is likely going to be just using mobile all over the board here, and now things are looking extraordinarily grim indeed for Kith. She ends up putting out a copy of Raid, so 0 cost. She's able to steal a resource. Kith is now up to 4, allowing her to play something like a Clavex Warleader, but no Eldar units are presently damaged, and Kith, if she retreats, is going to lose the fight by default since there are no other units in play, and as soon as she takes a single point of damage, this Iyanden Wraithguard sitting at the table is going to be very, very capable of ending the game in Kith's destruction immediately. So Dan indicates that he has passed. What else could we possibly see from our Dark Eldar player? We could see some small, weak units. That's not really going to make much of a difference. Archon's Terror isn't going to make much of a difference, and Clavex Warleader doesn't have any decent targets for it. So at the moment, this is looking like it's going to be all but certain doom for Packmaster Kith. But what, if anything, can papakahnn play to try to claw his way out of this? We do see a copy of a Warlock Destructor put into play at planet number 1, but is that going to be enough? What other action, if anything, will Kith do? It seems as though papakahnn has indeed passed. Both players are picking where exactly they'd like to send their warlords. I suppose there's not any great reason for Baharroth not to go to planet number 2, just because mobile is indeed an option. The initiative token is in Kith's hands anyways. Kith surprisingly chooses to go to planet number 2, I suppose just to spare him the humiliation of a warlord assassination loss, and we see Baharroth go to planet number 1, so the Archon's Palace is going to deprive Dan of one of those cards that I'm sure he sorely wants. Papakahnn ends up generating 1 card, 0 resources. He's got 2 resources. That's only enough for an Archon's Terror. That's not really going to be doing much of anything beneficial for him at this point. And in regard to income for Baharroth, we only see a single resource trickling in. For mobile, we see Baharroth's Hawks and the Soaring Falcon all move to planet number 1, and at this point, it's looking like this Warlock Destructor is not going to stand much of a chance at all. The initiative is very much going to be in Baharroth's hands, and this Iyanden Wraithguard is going to destroy the Warlock Destructor in a single attack. So what exactly are we going to see, if anything, from our Dark Eldar player? Are we going to see an Archon's Terror just to stubbornly remove the Iyanden Wraithguard from the battlefield? We do end up seeing exactly that, so that Iyanden Wraithguard is now banished, so it seems as though the Warlock Destructor is going to get in at least 1 attack, just because there's nothing else that Dan has that could potentially destroy it, unless he similarly wants to be very stubborn and play a Gift of Isha to return to play an Iyanden Wraithguard just to destroy this. We see Baharroth's Hawks take a swing for 3, but a Searing Brand reduces that down to 1 point of damage incurred by our Warlock Destructor, and the Warlock Destructor, is it going to retreat pointlessly? Is it going to attack and potentially kill off one of these units? It takes a swing at an unexhausted Baharroth's Hawks, which is outright destroyed, and now it's our Eldar player's opportunity to attack, and papakahnn finally calls out the GG, so very good game, very well played on the part of both players. Dan Napolitano has ended up triumphant. Baharroth has beaten Packmaster Kith. Very, very well played game by papakahnn. A very long game, but a very excellent game indeed. Very long. Dan says he is literally shaking. Definitely a lot of anxiety going on. Absolutely fantastic play on the part of both players, but as ever, thank you so much for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're encouraged to share this content, as the more viewers end up watching these videos, the more potential new players we might end up luring to join our community, and of course, buying into this game and sending the message to Fantasy Flight Games to keep on supporting this game, keep on releasing expansions and new products to keep this game alive. If you'd like to get in touch with me, potentially to have me spectate and commentate a game of your own, feel free to get in touch with me through Twitter or through Facebook, and if at any point you feel so inclined to help cover some of my operating expenses and file hosting fees, I'd be honored were you to visit my Patreon. But in any case, thank you once again for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.